All right. We're going to give everybody just a couple minutes to log on. We've got a bunch of people already logging in, so that's great. We have a lot of people coming today. So hopefully Ed and Dave and Chris have some interesting news. I'm not going to necessarily say it's good, but it'll be interesting news for sure.
There's no good news.
People logged in, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everyone to Webinar Wednesday. We are very excited to have you all here today. I see some familiar names and I see a lot of new names. So we've got a lot of great participants today. Today we're going to be talking about lumber. It is the topic of the century right now. Today's topic is lumber case study. Controlling lumber is a fairy tale, but lumber management and cost control can be a reality. Ed and Dave and Chris have had their finger on the pulse for the last 4 months or so, maybe 6 months even, keeping an eye on what's going on with lumber and how to make the best use of it and control your costs. So I'm going to pass it over to them in just 1 second. But before I do, if you kind of look down at the bottom of your screen, you might have to pull your mouse down. There are some little icons down there. We have a Q&A bubble right there. We will take questions throughout the presentation. Likely we'll reserve most of those until the end so we can maintain the flow of the webinar. And then you'll also see that there's a chat bubble. That's a way for you to communicate directly with me. So if you're having any issues or you see anything that if for some reason the sound's not coming through or something like that, you can reach out directly to me and I can answer that question for you and help do any troubleshooting in the background. But with that, I'm going to pass it over to Ed, Dave, and Chris to help you guys get a better grasp on what's going on with lumber. Take it away, guys.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. So Dave Burleigh, myself, Chris, have been doing some lumber workshops with builders. And what we're going to talk about is we really can't control the market, but we can control how we use the lumber, how we design the lumber. And just keep, checking with your design professionals and asking for some other alternatives. So Dave and Chris, you want to quick introduce yourself and then we'll get going?
Yeah, my name is Dave Burleigh. I'm with a company called BIMaire. We are a consulting firm that deals with virtual reality, drafting, and estimating. And we partnered with Shinnn Consulting to help on the estimating side. And more importantly, Ed and I joined forces back late in 2020 to try to rethink how we do our lumber estimating to best control our usage and therefore the cost as well.
Thanks, Dave. So I met Chris through Dave relatively recently. I'll let Chris tell him about himself, but in very short order, the three of us have done a lot of work. And it's just a lot of fun working with these two guys. So Chris, tell us a little about yourself, please.
Yeah, hey, my name is Chris Hauck. I've been in the building industry for the past 25 years. I currently work for Cold Builders in Salt Lake City, and I'm the engineering manager. And I'm pretty much focusing on framing for the past 20 years on the engineering and design side.
Good. Emma Jane already covered that. We've already told you about us. So this whole session, and I looked at the list this morning, there's a lot of folks on the list that we know and worked with, and there's a lot of newer folks on there. So the newer folks, if you have any questions or afterwards, feel free to email us. We'd be happy to help you. But the whole idea here is to control the lumber costs. Like I said, I can't control the market. The market is absolutely insane. I'm hoping that one day it calms down, and every time I think it's going to calm down, it surprises me again. We'll talk a lot about waste. How do we minimize the waste? And what the three of us have done a lot is starting with design. How do I design to use the proper materials to get some of the cost out? Like I said, I can't control the material, but I can control the design. So I'll go through a couple slides here, and then we're going to turn it over and more on our case study of what we've done with builders in the last few months to try and control the cost of lumber. First of all, there's a lot of waste. A lot of waste is because of poor design. a lot of ways to support delivery methods, that kind of stuff. So I really want to do is start thinking about, just get the optimize the framing as best we can, control the usage, and then start controlling the delivery of the products. And before, my in days of old, I'd probably negotiate with a lumber company to try and get as much lumber delivered at one time. Now, every second that lumber's on the ground, it's open for theft and misuse. We'll talk a little bit about, savings per occurrence, and a lot of times what we don't think about is, we found $500. Well, it doesn't seem like much, but we start looking at it over the cost of the year, it adds up a lot. So over the years, we've done a lot of job visits, and this site here had more lumber. I go on forever and ever on how much lumber they had laying around. We start thinking in terms, every one of those boards is worth $10, $12, $15 these days. There's a lot of material. So I want to control not just the design, but how I'm using the material. Today, just to torture myself, I do every single morning, I log on to go see what the lumber market's doing. And this is right out of NASDAQ. So yesterday it closed at 481. I never thought I'd ever see the day it broke 1,000, but it passed by 1,000 like it was standing still. So this time last year, right in the beginning of COVID, we were at 336 1,000. And you can see it just keeps going up and up and up. The housing market is so hot, I don't know that there's any relief in sight. Typically, we'll see some relief. Spring's hot, and then we'll see some relief in the summertime. But everything I'm hearing right now, that's not the case. And we're also worried about shortages. I talked a little bit about use and design. We've really got to teach our teams in the field and our framers how to design. I mean, this house here, I don't know, forget how many windows were in the house, but there's double stud, double jack. That's a lot of wasted material. There was no reason for it. And by the way, the plan said otherwise. This particular case, there's 20 windows in the home. When we did this back in January, it was $873 for a 9-foot 2x4. I think it's up higher than that now. You just look at what the impact of doing this over the course of a year. It's crazy. And this is based on 100 homes a year. What's going to happen to your cost? And it's not just window openings. There's a lot of different openings, a lot of different use of materials. And Dave will talk about that in a few minutes. Another thing you start looking about is interior non-bearing walls. We just did this recently, switching to 2-foot on center. Right now, on average, going interior non-bearing, it's about $2.50 a running foot. This is the kind of things we can start changing in our design, let alone some structural things. So that's about the end of that kind of stuff. I'm just trying to set the table for how we can start controlling the use. Dave, Chris, and I have done several workshops, several seminars, and one-on-ones with builders. So that being said, Dave, it's ready for you. I'm going to stop sharing and let you take over.
Awesome. So the first thing that we look at in a lumber standpoint, on an estimating standpoint, is in the old school methodology, we just wanted a lumber list. We wanted to know how many pieces of each stick size did we need to build the home. The problem that immediately arises from that is you can have the most accurate lumber list in the world, but if your framer doesn't know how to utilize that list, your list isn't worth anything. So Ed and I and Chris partnered up and said, well, let's try to hone in on that. Chris and I came from working with a plant together to help him estimate for wall panels, and came to the conclusion that wall panels are wonderful because of the amount of control we get in them, but they're not practical in every market. But we decided let's look at a house as if it's a panel, even if it's stick built. Instead of just doing lineal feet of wall by type, let's actually break that into sections based on our top and bottom plates. And in doing that, then we can hone in on how many studs do we need for each one of those sections. And we can start locking down specifically what do we actually need to build the home. And then two is then we can pass on those details to the framer to show them this is how we came up with our list. If you use these wall section sizes and the locations that they're designed to be used in, you have enough material. If you need more material, then that means you're doing something incorrectly. You put a wrong wall section size somewhere. So it's to close the loop on, here's your bill of materials. This is what we want to order and pay for. But more importantly, this is how we want you to use that bill of materials. Basically giving an IKEA book on how to build that house, so that the framers know if they stay within the bounds of how to frame those walls and where those walls go, then they're covered on material. Bear with me 1 second. Let me share my screen.
So while Dave's doing that, what we've been finding out is there in the past when studs were 250 stud, we didn't really care how a framer used it. Now the framers are kind of building it to how their personality, their style. And what happens is it's not how we estimate the house. And today, when the cost of lumber, it really matters. Before, we used to always worry about larger picture things in the structure, and where I usually lean on Chris a lot for that kind of stuff. But now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty to find money.
Ed, can you see my screen okay?
You are good.
Perfect. So what we do differently today than we did even up into late 2020, in the old days, we as estimators would say that's a 2x4 exterior wall at 16 on center, and we just got a total lineal footage of those. And within that lineal footage, we had factors to say, you need a stud every X many feet. And it got you close, but the problem is it didn't take into account what happens when I break my bottom plate. Now I'm going from one 16-foot section to the next. Now I need an extra stud in that location to close off both of those wall sections. So what we converted to is now we think of the plan as if we're building the plan in a factory. So we go through and outline what all of our dimensions are based on what our maximized framing is. So for example, on a 16 on center, 16 foot is the best we can ask for in a stick frame environment. We'd love to build every wall at 16 feet. That way we're not cutting our bottom plate. We're not messing with our top plates. We need an even stud count. We don't have any studs that are closer than they need to be. But once we drop down from that, 14 9.5 is actually the next size to see, to be able to still say we're not wasting any studs. I don't have any studs that are too close to one another. So once we lay that out, if I take a, give me 1 second while this opens up. So if I have a 2x4 wall, I'm going to be 8 foot. Let's say we're going to use Southern Pine. I want 16 on centers. I've already set, when I did my layout for these second floor exterior walls, I already determined that I need a 14 9.5 section for this first wall. So if I select my 14 9.5, I'm going to decide what do I need. Do I need OSB? Do I need no sheathing? Do I need T-ply? I'm going to go OSB on this one. I do want an exterior wall, and I'm making contact with lumber. Once I set that, then when I count that wall type, I can now see that to make that wall, I need 12 2x4 by 92 and 5/8 studs. I need one 2x4 by 16 for my bottom plate. Then I need 2 additional for my top plate. And I need 3 3/4 sheets of OSB to cover that specific wall section. Again, that lets me then hone in my material list because I've already solved this is what it takes to build that wall. Then when I talk waste, I'm only talking true waste. What percentage of my studs do I need to account for being twisted, having huge knots in them, the occasional miscut, things like that. But I don't need to just throw this huge, 10 to 20% waste factor because I know that maybe my estimating wasn't spot on to begin with. This is giving me the comfort of knowing that my wall is properly estimated. Now I only need to worry about those variable conditions that I may need a little bit of extra waste to be accounted for. So we go through and we do that to the entire house. We want to set out each wall as its own independent wall so that it has its own independent material list that goes with that wall. Once we finish doing that with the walls themselves, now we're going to go look at our corners also. We've identified that corners are an area that unfortunately just kind of get fudged when they're being estimated, and they shouldn't be. We know what all those corner details are. You as a builder should know which corner details you're using in your homes. So now we know what's the actual stud count that we need to achieve a corner. What we want to watch for is that a lot of times we're seeing lumber yards are really good at using kind of vague terms. They love calling things a 5-stud corner. If we asked you how many studs are in a 5-stud corner, the answer is going to be 5. In reality, the answer is only 3 because 2 of those studs are already accounted for when we counted our walls because we know we have in studs on every wall. So even there, cutting 2 studs per exterior corner, and you're going to have 12 to 20 exterior corners on a home. We're talking 24 to 40 studs that we've just removed just by not paying attention to the nomenclature, but understanding what actually makes that corner happen and what material do I need to achieve that corner. Then we're going to go through, did you have a question, Ed?
So I was going to say, one of the things that, and the reason why we do this is we want to control the lumber list versus the lumber yard. I looked at the list this morning, and there are several of you on that are on here now that are allowing the lumber yard to do it because in days of old, it was easier to let them manage it. What Dave's talking about here is controlling the estimate. He just talked about picking up 40 studs on a small house just on corners. And by the way, there's no added value to a buyer because how you frame a corner. So a lot of this is you have to control your estimate, control the design, and then teach your team and your framers how to do what Dave just described.
So we want to apply the same theory to our wall openings. So on our doors and windows, we need to predefine how are we framing our windows, how are we framing our door openings, and then we need to hold to that. So if your detail says you're going to do a single jack and single king, that's what we need to make sure is happening because that's all we're going to order is the material to achieve that opening. The biggest part of this really comes down to the field itself. We can help you derive extremely accurate estimates, extremely accurate bill of materials, extremely accurate details, but then we need to rely on the field to actually enforce those. They need to make sure that the home is being framed the way that you asked for the home to be framed, and make sure that the openings are being framed the way that you asked to frame those openings. If we deviate from that at all, then we're already back to the bill of materials didn't matter because we allowed the framer to operate outside of the plan that was designed and ordered specifically based on that design.
So Dave, what we're finding out a lot is we haven't been managing our framers to this level in the last few years because lumber was reasonable. Now that we need to pay attention to it. There's 2 things we're finding out. One is the superintendents really just hadn't paid attention to it during the build. Now we have to pay attention to it during the build. The supers have to be there. Somebody's got to be hands-on with the framer to describe what Dave just was talking about from the superintendent to the framer. Because otherwise, they're just going to pull the material off.
And Ed, in today's day of technology, that's much easier to do than it's ever been before. In the past,
Great.
when we worked with builders with framing, and they were having issues with the material list being too heavy, too light, whatever the issue is, for us to really get a feel for what was happening, I'd have to drive down to the airport, hop on a plane, fly to whatever city we're in and go do some tours. In today's day and age, we're able to do that generally remotely at this point, whether it's FaceTime through the phone or Matterport tours. We have a lot of technology at our hand that we can, we as consultants and you as the builders directly, you can get a feel for what's happening in your homes without necessarily having to leave the office and go take a look at it. But it is critical. I come from a purchasing background with one of the top builders in the nation, and I know it's very difficult at times to get out and see what's actually happening, to understand why am I having variances. But we need to harness that technology that we have to make sure that we're keeping an eye on those things. That if we're framing our first house using this methodology, we need to have a builder on site while the home is being framed. As a purchasing guy or an estimating person, I want to make sure that I also am in tune to that I'm seeing what's happening, that I'm making sure that that the lumber list is adequate because I'm holding my framer accountable to framing it the way that I asked them to frame the home.
Exactly. We've tightened up the lumber list. If we send out a big fat pile of lumber, they're going to use up all that lumber and blow through it pretty quickly. So again, it's just getting that information out, getting good details on the plans and education process. The first couple of times you really tighten these things up, you're going to find that the framer has to work a little harder to that. There's one thing I want to talk about in a couple of minutes will be about delivery of material, but Chris's background was design. When we did a workshop with the builder in two different workshops I want to talk about, we did. One was in Dallas, and the other one was a builder that Dave and I have been working with in New York. The builder in Dallas, the engineer did an excellent job on designing so the Dallas market stick frame, almost all stick frame, a lot of long materials, but they did a really good job on the design. And one of the things that Chris told me is I've always suspected, Chris, if I have 20 different designers, how many different design ideas do I get?
Most likely 19.
And my point there is, unless you're challenging and asking why, and with materials changing constantly, you've on the design side, what Dave just went through on that design side, we've got to be really, really diligent on watching and literally, micromanaging this. So Chris, you want to talk a little bit about the builders that we work with on going through the materials and the sizing and different perspectives?
Yeah, it's sometimes it's a lot of builders go to the lumberyard to get their plans designed. What is not a bad thing. There are some lumberyards who are doing excellent jobs, but then in the end of the day, the lumberyard is trying to sell lumber, so they're gonna try to sell as much material as possible. Usually, it's a better route if you have your own engineer to does your framing for you, your framing plans, and you take your material list to the lumberyard. That's usually because you compare apples to apples. If you have your lumberyard doing your plans for you, like Ed said, if you send it to 90 lumberyards, you get probably 19 different takeoffs.
Agreed. Chris and I worked real hard with this builder. We went through 3 different plans, and Chris, you and I banged our heads against the wall, but that designer did an excellent job. They were really looking at the sizing material, the spacing material.
It usually depends on the market too. Like I know Strand from Dallas, and there's, it's they're doing an excellent job. It usually depends on the engineer how dedicated they are to it. But it's also up to the builder. When what Grant Holmes did is they pretty much challenged every single piece of lumber. You know, they ask, is that necessary? Is it not necessary? And the more questions you ask, the more accurate your engineering is going to be, you know, and more cost efficient.
We had two other builders I want to talk about a little bit. One was in the Minnesota market, one was upstate New York. Minnesota, they kind of left it, to Chris's point, they kind of left it up to one lumber supplier to do it. And to Chris's point, depending on the skill level, who they give it to, my preference is I usually lean on manufacturers a little heavier than just lumber yards. Some lumber yards got great designers, some maybe not, but the point being, you want to challenge it. When Chris and I looked at that particular house, we had several $1,000s worth of LVLs and I-joists to build over the garage because they didn't look at it different ways. It really should have been challenging them. So that was the one, and I'll have Chris comment on that. The second one, I'll have Dave talk about a builder in upstate New York. When I first started looking at the plans and going through the details, I was surprised what little details they had, and what details they had were way wrong and way over spec. So Chris, you want to talk a little bit about the Minnesota scenario?
Yeah, I mean, the builder in Minnesota, so they gave their plan to a local lumber yard and they did the design, and pretty much what they did is, like, I want to call it old school. They see a wall and they put a beam under it, but you know, usually it's always more cost efficient if you can carry a wall perpendicular, you know, with I-joist and just cut out beam material. And it was just not really value engineering it, you know, not taking your time to see which way would be more cost efficient. They ran all floor joist in one direction, and you know, that's something old school where they say, like, hey, if we go one way, we're always going to run it one way. But you know, in a lot of times it's more cost efficient if you just run it wherever it's more cost efficient, I would say.
Yeah, that one we had somewhere about 18 parallels in a garage that wasn't needed. The other one I want Dave to talk a little bit about, it was a builder in upstate New York. We got the plans. And by the way, a lot of times what happens is when lumber was so cheap, this didn't matter that much. Now it matters a lot. I mean, Dave talked about just use of material between 2-foot on centers, the corners, intersections, that kind of stuff. On a 2,400 square foot house, we just did a review on that, and there was somewhere about $1,000 in material just by looking at the use. So Dave, you want to talk a little bit about our friends in upstate New York and their roofing system?
Yeah, so we started with them, I believe, back in February. And first we were just looking at their plans just kind of holistically. What are the design issues that we see? The first one that stood out like a sore thumb is in that market, it is still a dimensional joist market. And we found occurrences over and over again where had that joist been less than 3 inches smaller in span, we could have downsized the joist. So we challenged the builder to, let's look at the actual floor plan itself. Does that 1 to 3 inches actually matter? Because there is a significant cost in adding just those few extra inches in span. So we are able to align on that and start shrinking some of these rooms, again, very minimally. 1 to 3 inches isn't something you're really going to feel in the home necessarily, but they were able to see an impact to their budgets by doing that. Then we started looking at their framing practices themselves and found that they still frame their interior walls at 16 on centers. Non-bearing interior walls don't need to be 16 on center. Got significant savings switching that over as well. Then we started looking at what they were doing in their basements. So back in February when we started, there was a very valid argument to we should discontinue all this steel and switch over to LVLs instead. Unfortunately, the reality of the world is that with LVL prices effective in April, that's one that we have to hold on to. They want to do that long term, but The impact for today's market is they're going to actually retain the steel temporarily because they're getting their steel at such an aggressive price. All in, we've gone through 10 plans with them to date, and we're sitting at about a 12% direct cost savings in their homes by going through and analyzing every part and piece, and then also converting from lump sum bid management into unitized pricing, where now we're going to be ordering the lumber off of a material list instead of just one big swag number that was all inclusive of what we needed for the home, what the lumber yard decided to account for mistakes, for errors, for anything that they wanted to account for. One thing I'd like to mention also in today's market is that while our main focus right now is controlling the cost, we also need to be realistic in understanding that there are severe shortages across the country. So not only are we reducing our cost, but we're extending how many homes we can build with that current supply. For every extra stud that you put in a house, or T-ply is a great example right now. For every extra sheet of T-ply that gets wasted, that's a sheet of T-ply that may not be in stock for your next home. So we really need to look at this from both avenues. Yes, we want to save money. That's always the driving force in our decisions. But we also need to be cognizant that as supply continues to dwindle, we're only helping ourselves by doing this, because we're ensuring that there's going to be ample supply for us to get through our homes. I'm in the Salt Lake market, which the average Salt Lake home builder will build 300% more homes this year than they did last year, which sounds wonderful. Everybody gets excited about that. It's a great market. Everybody's going to make a killing. Unfortunately, the lumber yards here can only supply at 85% of what they supplied last year. So there is a huge delta between what people have the ability to do and what they actually have the capability to do. So it really does help to get as tight as you can, so that you make sure that you have that stockpile for future.
So one thing just brought up, Dave, that was on my list to talk about today was the material shortages. And also when we're comping, Dave and I also work for another builder in the Virginia market, and we're kind of redesigning the first floor systems. And what we're keeping in mind is material shortages are changing drastically all the time. So what Dave is talking about is you're owning the estimate, number one, not to mention the builder that we talked about in the New York market. They never really looked at span tables and things. You really got to know the cost of your materials. And now with the shortages, I want to know what I've designed, what's my backup plan if I have a problem, what else can I do, kind of a thing. So that's really important. If you own the estimate, you know your spans, you know your material list, you know when you have a problem, because right now there's rolling shortages. In my market last week, one of my other builders that I know very well had 15 houses worth of lumber getting delivered in the next 10 days. There was no OSB to be found. So it's constantly changing. So always keep your mind on that. A couple other things I want to touch base on, and then make sure we have some time for questions and answers. I saw a couple of questions pop up. One is we talked all the different ways to design, control. Chris talked about, making sure you're challenging your designer, so they're thinking outside the box, keep pushing, looking for those older materials. The next that we typically do not a very good job on is, again, making sure the framers know how we're framing. But the other thing is, how is your lumber being delivered? In days, I go on job sites all the time, and we just did this a couple of weeks ago in the superintendent seminar, showing how badly we do a job of delivering lumber. So make sure you have some sort of a scope of work for your lumber yards. What's the framer going to do when the first thing on his PO is all-weather wood that's going on top of the foundation? That's at the bottom of the pile. Unless you dictate how lumber is being delivered and it ties into an estimate, you just dropped $75,000 on the ground, but never told the framer how to use it. That is slightly insane to me. So That's another thing to make sure that you're controlling the delivery's tied into the estimate, and you're sharing this with the superintendent and the framer so they can better manage it. In my way back in my life, way back when I was a framer, so I spent a lot of time in this area educating framers on how I estimate the house plan. Dave does outsource estimating for builders, and we're busy. He's busy as all get out today for one reason, is we got to get away from letting lumberyards kind of, we have no idea what a lumberyard gives us. Lumberyard gives us a lumber. Is my lumber list tight and my unit prices are up, or do they round up? You have no idea. So Dave, any thoughts or feelings on that?
Yeah, so one thing that we keep running into is, unfortunately, a lot of people look at that lumber list on the bid, and what they're really looking at is, what's that bottom number? What's my total all-in price on this house? Does that feel right or not right? The concern we have, and we identify this regularly with our clients, is that that bottom number may not really be the main issue. It's that, how are they getting to that bottom number? So they may be heavy on one material, light on another material. And at the end of the day, as they're swapping materials in and out, you're not seeing a ton of VPOs because of that. But what we're also not seeing is what's actually happening. If we know the materials that we should actually have, and we identify that we're constantly getting extra studs, then that helps us identify, why are we getting those extra studs? Is it misuse? Is it miscut? Is it an estimating issue? What caused that shortage? But when we're dealing with these lumber supplier supplied estimates, it's a lot harder to try to track down, why were they wrong in this item, light here and heavy there. So we can't help manage that and get it in line if we don't understand where it came from in the first place.
So Chris told you, if I have 20 different designers, you got 19 different designs. The same thing happens if I'm outsourcing the estimates to a lumberyard. Now, another thing, and I'll let Chris talk about that in a second. The other thing is, lumberyards right now in somewhere are an allocation. So I'm going to bring up the topic to talk about is, in the past, if you only have one lumberyard, now is not the time to get all headstrong and try to go recruit other lumber companies. You got to start getting tight to your lumber companies and forecast that need. So before I go into that, Chris, any more comments on the design and the engineering side and the different personalities and ideas in design?
No, it's usually a really good idea to have, like, before you finalize your construction documents, to have like a pre-engineering done on your design, so that sometimes, like Dave said before, you move a wall a couple of inches, or you change the wall height, or whatever, you change the roof pitch. It can make a big difference in the engineering of the house. Or just adding a little wing wall or whatever. I think that is something what not a lot of people do, but it's actually really beneficial if you guys start doing that.
Huge. One of the things, and this is really not about product design, in the product design segment, we pay a lot of attention to maxing out those spans and knowing what a span really means. I mean, I hear a lot of builders all the time looking at the span isn't out to out, the span is really in to in, and look at those span tables and how do I minimize that. The other thing right now, and I saw Chuck just pop something up on a chat. I'm going to give Chuck a minute to talk in a little bit. Is the one thing I want to make sure of is, right now, stay close to your lumber yards. If you only have one, I don't know that you'll get a second one to even think about, pricing you. The couple of builders we're working with now that have multiples, we're trying to, increase our odds of being able to get the material. They're in a position now is they're not shopping, they're not pricing, they're just trying to get the material, and that's partly what's driving that cost up. So Chuck, I think you're on. Can you want to unmute yourself and talk a little bit? I think I saw your name in Daytona pop up.
Oh, I was just bringing a couple of points up that are really easy to look at. When we had the operation in Daytona, A couple of things we paid a lot of attention to is a start point for the framer. I wanted my windows to basically fall on my basic stud layout to save at least one, possibly two studs per window and door. And if they start anyplace else other than one start point, it will cost us at least two additional studs. The other thing is on the non-load bearing headers or non-load bearing walls, we talked about the spacing, but I continually see bearing headers and non-load bearing walls where it could just be a horizontal 2x4 to close off the door or the window or whatever we have on a non-load bearing wall. The other thing, and you just mentioned it, Chris did, the pitch of the roof has a big impact, especially if you're framing the roof. And if you are framing the roof, and Ed just said it's the inside measurement for bearing, but if you're getting into premium lumber, scab on the dormer ends or the tail ends. It doesn't need to go all the way out for your overhang. You can have it from bearing point to bearing point. You can scab in your ends and save quite a bit of money on premium grade material. So just a couple of added things that are pretty easy to do, but can generate a lot of money.
So I think what everybody's talking about here is really pay attention to the little details. Dave talked about really looking at the assembly of your stick framing a house, really looking at the assembly of that house to get down to look at each individual piece. Nowadays, when a single 2x4 or 2x6 stud is over $10 a piece, it really starts to really matter about how many of those we're using. Little 24 square foot house on a plan review the other day was about 120 studs. That's a lot of money. So right now, it's really the attention to detail from the design through making sure, checking with the engineering. What Chris and I did with that last house, and Dave for the builder in the Midwest, was really start challenging, look at the span tables, getting other opinions. And by the way, when we're doing this, I'm never dropping my design criteria to be substandard. I have a certain minimal criteria, and I'll stay with that. But if we don't know what that is and challenge our designers and work with them, you're throwing a lot of money away. I have a call tomorrow with an engineer, an architect, and then two different design firms to go through the design ideas. They're two drastic different ideas. And by the way, on a 2,800 square foot townhouse, we got about $4,000 on the table just on conceptuals. Emma Jane, we had a lot of good information here. I want to make sure we save some time for some questions and answers. I saw one question pop up about the centers on non-bearing, and I saw Dave respond back. That's 2 foot on center. And by the way, all these little interior non-bearing walls, the framer's holding to his layout and throwing a stud, whether he needs one or not. What Dave's estimating plan is doing is, first of all, I'm using 2 foot on center. And like I said early on, that compared to 16 with the cost of material right now is over $2.50 a running foot, let alone really paying attention to when I'm putting studs in, when I'm not. Chris talked about, as I'm doing designs, can I change some of my design loads by putting in a little wing wall or things like that? So we have a lot of things on the table.
Well, you can also use the ladder tees on the interior walls.
Absolutely.
I see them doing ladder tees on the exterior walls, and then they're studding the corners on the interior walls, which is crazy.
Yep, agreed. So a lot of this is, so Dave mentioned a Matterport camera, and we're getting ready to do this for a couple different builders. What this camera is meant for marketing, but we're able to actually get these houses videoed or photographed and actually start walking through and teach you guys how to start pulling this material out. Dave, if you have a version that you can show. Meanwhile, Emma Jane, do we have any questions from anybody? I mean, it's a lot of deep information here.
The only question we had was the one you answered, which was, what did you switch interior walls to? And you guys answered the 24 the
Okay.
2 foot on center. So that's the only question we've got. We do have it open for questions. If you'd rather speak your question, I can allow a couple people
Absolutely.
to if you want to raise your hand, I'll be able to see your hand raised and allow you to speak your question too, because I know this is a super complex topic. We have a question that just came in from Randy. He says, with current pricing, is there any merit to using single LSL windows, window headers instead of standard headers, 2x6 or 2x12 sandwiched?
Absolutely. In fact, it's kind of funny you bring that up. The townhouse tomorrow, I start reading through the details from the architect. He had triple 2x12s in a header for no reason whatsoever. But we threw out there, it's a very good question, Randy, by the way. And what we did is we're using an LVL single header, and then we're able actually to insulate it. And that reduced the cost. This is why you really got to know your material types and have those unitized pricing so you can change these things out. So depending on load and application, in this case, it actually worked well.
We had another question come in, and please excuse me if I don't say your name correctly, Dinesh. They asked have you explored using metal studs on interior walls?
So years ago in early 2000s, when we had what we thought was the worst lumber crisis ever, they had these lightweight studs. And I know certain builders are starting to look at that, because right now, last I looked, I called my lumber guy last week, and a 9-foot metal stud was only $650 a stud. I haven't seen it yet, but I think it's coming. Chris or Dave, any comments?
Yeah, so we've explored that in Salt Lake a few times. The challenge that we constantly run into is it's a different type of framer that we need to get, which is also hard to come by, or the cost to get a traditional crew converted over and ready is a cost that has to be absorbed somewhere. So we generally have hit the conclusion that it's not necessarily worth it, but that was at much lower pricing than what we're seeing today. Yep. Where that likely could be offset at this point, that retraining and retooling would still justify the switch.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed. I mean, and that's why we're a big proponent of knowing your unit pricing. And when Dave and I are doing this assignment for the builder in Virginia, what we do today might be different next week, because what materials are doing. Locally, one of the shortages that changed our design on these townhouses that I'm working on is we had 14-inch I-joist on the table, and then most recently they spiked more than 11/7/8. But not only do they spike, they became hard to get. So you've got to constantly be looking at this. That's why we always push owning your material estimate and knowing what the unitized pricing is. And if you're not, you have no transparency. You can't do any of this. Chuck just put something up. I saw it pop up, and I believe it's making sure that the framer understands your design and that you're enforcing it. Dave and I talked about doing the details in a good, better, best kind of scenario, and making sure that those details are on the plans. Now, first of all, when Dave and I were working with the builder in upstate New York, they had details for a lot of things. First of all, I have to give them credit. I've never seen so many details, 11/17. They're little 1/8 inch, little tiny 2-inch squares. Keep in mind, your framers out in the field, the snow, the wind, the sun, whatever. Make sure these things are very easy to read. And by the way, the majority of the framers across the country may not speak English. Nice, good details so they can see it and understand it is really important.
Well, we don't have any other questions. Either everybody's just sitting there going, oh, I'm not sure how to absorb all of this, or they'll be sending you some questions a little bit later. I'm really excited for you to share this, Dave.
So this is really cool.
So we have a client on the East Coast that uses Matterport for marketing like every builder does at this point. However, in a conversation with them, we were trying to align on what's happening in the field versus details. and they were able to go do a Matterport on a house that had just finished framing for us, so that it gave us the ability to walk this home with them. And where details really matter is this is where when we open this, it opens right here. All I have to do is turn 90 degrees to the right. And we ran into our first situation where what was built does not match what was designed and what was purchased. Because we were able to quickly see that instead of doing a full height wall to the bottom of the trusses in this volume area, we actually piggybacked a pony wall on top of a regular wall. Doesn't seem like a huge deal, but that's bottom and top plate that was not accounted for because we weren't planning on having two walls, as well as it altered what our stud counts were. Because I was no longer using these tall studs. I was using 9-foot studs and then filling in with cut pieces for that pony wall. This is a Matterport, I can promise you, is available in your market. There's someone who specializes in it. On average, we're seeing it's about $300 to have them go do one on a house. That's $300 well spent because you are going to save way beyond $300 a house moving forward by going through the step where you can share the frame walk with other people to get input on what are we seeing, what do we like, what do we not like, what's not matching your details, where is this waste coming from. It's super wise investment. If you're really trying to hone in on your lumber usage, this is a great way to harness that technology to be able to get as many eyes on it as possible to freely walk through the home and take a look wall by wall what's going on.
So when Dave and I looked at this before, you start zooming in and scrutinizing where framers throw extra studs here and there. In between that door jamb, there might be extra studs on the right, unless depending on what the point load might be, there could be extra studs. Going through in this level of detail, literally, I'd bet if we did this house, how many square feet is this house, Dave?
With the basement, it's about 2,600, I believe.
So if I was going to do the over under bet right now, I'd say I could probably pull at least 100 studs, maybe more, out of this house, and that's not getting into the details. Like that header on the front there, I have it on my screen. Dave zooms in. It looks like it's got extra jacks, probably not needed. There's a truss up above it that may not have a point load. I can't really tell. But these are kind of things that really start to add up when you look at it in detail. And like I said, a year ago, nobody cared about this. You know, when a stud was $350 a stud, you know, we were just blowing and going. Now it matters. Yeah, I'd say without 2-foot on centers as part of it, on interior non-bearing, I'd say you have 100 to maybe 125 studs or more in this house that are extra, maybe more. Anybody questions, comments, thoughts?
We had one
I don't
question.
think this
We had one question. I'll just answer it real quick. Somebody joined a little bit late today, and I know we had some people join in kind of in the middle of the presentation. If you weren't with us from the very beginning, you can access the recording for this afternoon at our website, builderpartnerships.com/events, and then click on the webinars tab. So you can watch the presentation in its entirety.
learn something new every day.
But other than that, there aren't any more questions.
So I got to give Chuck some kudos here. We always call him Chief Interrupter. He found a new way to interrupt. Now he knows how to use chat.
I was very impressed he was using chat today.
So was I. I was like duly noted. So Chuck, congratulations. So if anybody been to the seminars, that's one of the things as we go back and forth. So any other questions, comments?
We do
you guys have
one
any
more
questions?
question. Yeah. Mark wants to know what the name of the camera system is. It's called Matterport. And most likely your marketing department has one, has used one, or knows a lot about it because all the marketing departments want one. So I would go and talk to your marketing person to get a little bit more information. But you can always talk to Dave and Ed as well.
Or they might outsource it.
Yeah, but
Yeah, they might
there's
outsource it to
definitely
them,
some
Jen.
sort of contact, especially right now with Matterports. It would seem that off-site wall panel manufacturing would help with engineering and waste. Why has panelization not caught on? Oh, Chuck, this is one of your favorite topics.
Here comes Chief. So here's the thing: in different markets, it's hot. Like I was working for National back in the '80s, and they started it. It works very well. Right now, it controls cost. A lot of times, the reason why we have a problem to get the cost effective down is you have to work with your framer to get them to understand they'll build more houses in a month than they would without it. So I don't know why it's not more common. It's a great way to control the cost. We just did a plan review with a panel company on the design for a builder in the Midwest, and literally pulled about 120 studs out, so even they can get better. So if in your market, just keep looking around. You just got to work with the framer to get their number down to get the savings. Dave, I saw you nodding your head there.
Yeah,
I can hear the rocks rattling.
Our experience has been you have to include your framer. Because
Yep.
yes, you're probably going to spend a little bit more on the panel than you would have on the loose lumber. But at the same point, your framer needs to step up and understand that they should be getting a lower rate per square foot or lineal foot, however you're paying them, because they become drastically more efficient and can shave days off of a home. So it's a little bit of a balancing act where when we typically consider it with a client, we just make sure it's understood that you may have a temporary increase because you're going to have to work through that with your framer. But when we're reviewing it, we want to be looking at what should the framer be getting paid based on panels, and then work into that situation, which 9 times out of 10, the framers end up loving it once they get used to it. And they start to see that they're framing, 3 to 5 more houses a month. They love that, and they're all in. But they're not probably going to be super receptive right out of the gate. You're going to have to prove to them that it's a win-win for them to move to panelization as well.
So Dave's right. Super, they're not thrilled at all. They think you're taking money away from them. My experience is doing open book study with them. One of the things we first found way back when I did my first panels back in the 80s is I can take a framing crew and increase the size of the crew because I need less layout people, and I can, and depending on the market, either hire more labor type or start using a forklift type of device. But a lot of it is doing the open book. And to Dave's point, I agree. If I had a 6-man crew that can only do a house every 8 days, I might get 2-3 more houses a month out of that crew because of panelization. In bad weather environments up north, we get under roof faster. For us, a 3,200 square foot house, panel and truss, we could do all day long in 6 working days. So it really helps on your cycle time, as well as controlling costs. So,
Ed, one of the things that we look at in addition is we try to monitor theft. It's a lot harder to steal a panel than it is lumber. And that needs to be part of that equation. It's not just what happens to your base house direct. We need to be looking at all in. What's that change on BPOs? What's the change on theft? What's the change on damage,
waste,
returns? There's so many variables that when you lay all those out together, it's going to make sense. A lot of people just stop way too early at analyzing it.
Yeah, it takes some work. So depending on your market, you have to partner with a framer, get him to trust you. I've done it a few times, and it's really doing an open book, and I'm not taking money out of their pocket. That's what they're afraid of. Any questions, comments, anybody? This is a hot topic. And by the way, I can't wait for this to go away because I want to start reading about fishing, or motorcycles or something. But all I seem to be reading about is lumber. It's like it's all over the place. It's not going away anytime soon. I get several emails from lumber companies all around the country that I've been working with builders, and they're all pretty consistent that this demand, Dave just brought up, 300%. For the most people, what I'm hearing is, pretty much down to allotments from 85% of whatever you did last year. So it's not going away, but our only defense is to get more involved to control this. I saw a couple of the builders were on here that I've been working with, and it's hard. I mean, you've got to figure out how to start managing, and a lot of builders don't have the experience in the operation. So now is not the time not the time to run away from it. Now is the time to jump into it. Chris or Dave, any closing comments? Chuck, any closing comments?
All I would say, Ed, is I actually just randomly got an article forwarded to me. That as of today, the average home is about $36,000 more to build than it was at this time last year.
Yep. Keep in mind, everybody, you're dropping $50,000 to $75,000 on the ground, and you're not paying attention to it. In what other world would you put $75,000 in a bag in the middle of the street and not count it? So that's kind of like what's going on. Chris, Chuck, anything?
I'm good.
And Chuck might have stepped away from his computer.
Well, he's on a sailboat in Daytona.
Well,
Well, he's on a sailboat down in Daytona. If I was him, I wouldn't pay attention to this either. So, well, everybody, thanks for being a part of this. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and hope this was helpful.
Yep. Well, thank you so much, guys. Always a pleasure. Great information. And if you need anything from these guys, you can contact them directly. Their email, there'll be an email that comes out tomorrow with a link to our website and where the recordings are held. And they'll also have their email addresses, so you can contact them if you have any other questions. You can contact me if you need to get hold of them in the meantime. But thank you again for coming. We have webinars coming up. Timber Tech is in 2 weeks. And then we also have trade management with Rick Maurer in, I think, 3 weeks. So keep your eyes out for future webinars, and we'll see you all in a couple of weeks. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. See you, Chris. See you,
Thanks.
Dave. See you, Jane, everybody else.
Thanks, guys.